Hi everyone, and welcome to the third day of NZX's Virtual Global Dairy Seminar for 2020, and this is our 8th session so far. If you're signing in for the first time today, you missed a great panel on the future of fermented dairy protein a few hours ago. Definitely one to watch later. For today's session, we have an overview of the global food system. We've got Dr. Andrew Fletcher, Program Leader of Sustainable Food Systems at Fonterra, Olivia Finer, Commercial Associate at Fonterra, and Nick Smith, who's a Research Officer at the Reddit Institute. They'll be providing us with an overview of the global food system, including how it operates, with reference to the Delta model, which is a global food system mass balance that uses information about current production of major food items to predict the nutrition available to the average global citizen, both now and in the future. They'll also cover what the current global production of nutrition looks like and the role different sources of food play, as well as how the system can be changed and resulting consequences, which illustrate that the system is and must remain plant-based and animal optimized. So before we start, please make sure to download the event app for networking features, as well as access to Q&A and live polls, recordings post, and speaker and sponsor details. So a link to the web version of this can be found in the chat box if you go to webinar now. If you've got any questions today for the speakers, we have a Q&A made available throughout the session by the app. Questions can be voted up or liked. So if there's a question you'd like asked, please make sure to get voting. Attendees have been muted, but this shouldn't impact you hearing us. If you're having trouble, please see the troubleshooting on the left of your screen. We'll also be sending out a recording of the webinar afterwards, so you can rewatch anything you miss. Throughout the session, we've also got a poll relating to today's topic, and that is, what do you think consumers of dairy proteins value most? As you can see already, functionality and taste is most people's preference. We'll cover the results of this at the end. So I'm now going to pass on to Andrew, Olivia, and Nick. Thank you for being here and looking forward to your session.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Andrew Fletcher. I currently split my time between work with the Reddit Institute on Sustainable Nutrition and implementation of the National Dairy Sector Strategy, Dairy Tomorrow. With me this morning are Nick and Olivia, as introduced, and both of who have been involved in the development of the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative. And later on, Nick and Olivia are going to introduce and demonstrate one aspect of the work of SNI, which is the Delta model. Now, tomorrow, Friday the 16th of November, is World Food Day. It's the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And that organization has a goal to achieve food security for all and to make sure that people have regular access to enough high quality food to lead active, healthy lives. Tomorrow is a day for all of us to reflect on the challenges facing the global food system. We're doing this a day earlier today in this session. But our ability to effectively nourish an increasing global population is one of the key challenges that faces the human race. The global food system is incredibly complex. It's the world's largest economic sector, has multiple inputs and outputs. It's often politicized. It's subject to various social and cultural forces, and it touches every human being on the planet. There are a range of voices telling us how we should change the food system based on differing beliefs and viewpoints. And for us in New Zealand, as a food exporting nation, this has a critical impact on our economy. So charting a course for the food system of the future requires quality thinking and good discussion that's built on strong evidence-based foundations. The Sustainable Nutrition Initiative has been founded to meaningfully contribute to those discussions. And so this morning, Nick and Olivia are going to talk about one aspect of our work, the Delta model, which is a tool for exploring different futures for the food system. And they're going to cover an initial view about some of the things that model teaches us as we look at the global food system and how it serves us as human beings. So I'll hand over to Nick to take you through the background.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so yes, I'll give a bit of background around the global food system and our thoughts on it, and a quick introduction of how the Delta model works, and then let Olivier give the full demonstration of the model in action. So first of all, let's define the food system. So this figure is meant to be very complex and hard to understand because that's reflective of the global food system. When we talk about the food system, we have everything from the production on farm or from fisheries through processing, distribution, all the way to the consumer. But around that, there's a lot of other factors. For example, there's all the waste along that processing chain, and in home, there's the impact of that food on the consumer. And then there's the aspects outside of that direct chain, things like governance, regulations on food production, processing, and distribution, the demands from global food trade, the social aspects around food and what's acceptable, and of course, the environment, how that both affects the food system and is affected by it. So bearing in mind that degree of complexity, what is it about a global food system that is sustainable or not sustainable? And so when I say sustainable, I'm talking about much more than just environmental sustainability, which you classically hear as being the first concern. Really, sustainability encompasses, in a food system sense, food security, delivering sufficient nutrition, and doing so in a way that is economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable, can be performed indefinitely into the future. So that's quite a challenging concept to look at. And thinking about that previous image, how can we tell what one change at one end of the global food system will do to, say, nutrition at the other end? So at the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, we decided to focus on, first and foremost, on the nutrition for all aspect. Because crucially, if a global food system is not delivering nutrition to the global population, then it's not sustainable. It's fallen at the first hurdle. So what does nutrition for all mean? Well, essentially, it's enough food produced and enough nutrients produced within that. So that's energy, macronutrients, and micronutrients. And on top of that, we need to know that the food is well distributed so that everyone has access to enough, and that there's enough production to deal with adverse events, as we've seen over the last year. Now, compared to the global food system map that you saw earlier, there's a lot more data around certain aspects on the nutrition for all perspective. And what we realized is that we can model the nutrition side of this question. So that's where the Delta model comes in. The Delta model has been designed and built to allow us to investigate the global food system and future scenarios to find out what's a possible way of feeding the global population. And then after that, what are practical and ultimately optimal ways of doing so. So a quick sketch of how the model works. The user inputs some options to find the scenario. Those are things around total food production, both from animal and plant sources, and things like the degree of waste that occurs both in home and along the supply chain. The Delta model then compares that to existing data from the FAO on global food production, recycles in the amount that is used for feed, and then deducts that which is used for other uses, soaps, biofuels, that sort of thing, and the waste. What we're then left with is a total amount that is available for consumption as food. From that total available amount, we can derive the available nutrients using food composition data from the USDA. So we know the available nutrition for the global population. Simultaneously, the model takes demographic information, population, age, gender splits for the global population, both now and forecast into the future, as well as recommended daily intakes for all nutrients for those populations. Bringing those together with the nutrition available, the model returns an output of how much of each nutrient is available from that global food system and how that measures up to the recommended daily intake for a globally averaged system. A last important note that I will make before handing over to Olivia is that the Delta model is not about diets for the individual and what the individual should eat. The individual has much more choice in the food that they consume and the way they get nutrition than the world has. So what the Delta model is about is asking the question of what food do we as a planet need to produce to nourish the global population. And with that, I'll hand over to Olivia and you can see the model in action for yourself.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. So I will be giving a live demonstration of the Delta model and through that showing some key insights. So there's really 4 key messages that I want to share with you today using the model. Number 1, the fact the food system is and needs to be plant-based and animal optimized. Secondly, the importance of looking at nutrition required by the global population rather than just demand. Thirdly, the fact that the food produced currently provides enough macro, but not enough of some micronutrients. And finally, that not all food is wasted evenly. So this model is currently available online. Currently, you do need a login to access the model, but the main reason for that is really to control the number of users at one time to ensure the model runs efficiently. So when the model is opened, down the left-hand side, we have the scenario editor, which is the inputs into the model. So these numbers here under primary production is the amount of food produced, and that is the biomass that leaves the world's farms. And this information is taken from the FAO food balance sheets. It's categorized into animal and plant food, and all the food that is produced is aggregated up into 15 different categories. And the reason for that is just to make it more user-friendly for the user. So what we see here is that a total of around 10.5 billion tons of food is currently produced. And of that, 9.1 billion is plant, which is around 85%. So this is the first key message. The food is plant-based. 85% of all food is plant. But the key is it's animal optimized. And as we move further through the model, you'll see that while animal only takes up 15%, it plays a very important role in delivering the nutrition required. So there are 2 columns here, which allows 2 scenarios to be compared, so you can see the changes, or the delta, hence the name. Scenario 1 is preset as the 2018 baseline, so that is all the food produced in 2018, and that's feeding a 2018 population. Scenario 2 is the 2030 baseline, and you'll see all the food produced is the same as in 2018, but it's feeding a larger global population. There are also a number of different preset scenarios that can be set here. So this is the inputs into the model, and over on the right-hand side are the outputs. So these 6 charts here show that the nutrition supplied per person per day based on the food production settings. And it assumes a utopian scenario. So it assumes that all food produced is evenly distributed globally. The different color coding shows the different contribution by food group. So plant is shown as green, gray is eggs, red is meat, white is dairy, and blue is fish and seafood. And the nutrient supply is compared against the black bar here, which is the recommended daily intake. It's worth noting that the recommended daily intake is a weighted average based on the expected age and gender of the population, meaning that it's more representative of the requirements of the global population. And you'll see that the line is ever so slightly different across the two scenarios. And the reason for that is due to the different age and gender makeup of the population across the years. These range bars give the upper and lower limit for the recommended daily intake. So the black line is the optimal line, ideally what you want to hit, but these bars give a more of a range. So there are just 6 charts here on the summary page. We see energy, the macronutrients, and also lysine. Lysine is an essential amino acid, which means that the body cannot produce it, and it must be obtained from the diet. And lysine is often the most limiting amino acid. So that means if we are not consuming enough lysine, the body cannot make the proteins it needs, despite how much other protein it consumes. Now, it's really important to note what the Delta model is looking at is based on the nutrition required, not on the demand. And this is my second key message. So you've probably heard a lot of the rhetoric around the fact that we need huge increases in production globally to meet demand, something along the lines of 70%. While this is true, what the Delta aims to look at is what food production is needed to meet the nutrient requirements. So in reality, some individuals would require decreases in certain foods, while others would require increases. So on the summary page, we see just the 6 charts. To view more detail, you can navigate to nutrition and nutrient supply. And here you will see 30 different charts looking at macronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and all 9 essential amino acids. So what we see is that based on the current scenarios, so the 2018 baseline and the 2030 baseline, as the population grows, the nutrition supplied per person per day decreases. That's just because the same amount of food is being spread across more people, as we would expect. But what was really interesting is we see that against requirements, there is sufficient energy, sufficient macronutrients, but shortages come in the micronutrients, particularly calcium and also in vitamin E. There's also some other slight shortages that we start to see as the population grows, such as vitamin A, riboflavin, potassium, etc. So that's the really key insight, is we have enough of the macronutrients, but not enough of the micronutrients. And using Delta, we can start to modify the primary production settings to see the impact that that has on the nutrient supply. So for example, we might want to see how we can close the calcium gap. We know that dairy is a pretty rich source of calcium. So let's increase the dairy from 800 million tonnes to 2,000. Now you'll see that's quite a significant increase. And as we do that, the model recalculates and will show the revised settings on the charts on the right. When the model works, a little bit slow this morning. Has that come through for you, Andrew? All right. So the model should recalculate and show the revised settings on the right-hand side. And you can do that with any other of the primary production inputs. You can change the settings and see the inputs out on the right. You can also select a number of different input scenarios here. For example, we could select the 2030 vegan scenario. And this will remove all animal foods from the primary production input and recalculate, showing the impact of that. So what happens when we remove all of the animal foods is you'll see that the shortages we had against some of the micronutrients have now increased significantly. See here, calcium, the gap we had is now much larger, and gaps have now opened up in iron and in zinc. So that tells us that on a global scale, animal foods are required to meet nutrient requirements. That's not to say an individual cannot select a vegan diet. An individual can select different foods and supplements to ensure they're meeting their own personal requirements. But on world food production meeting world nutrient requirements, it's a different story. So to further emphasize that point, I'm just going to set back to the 2030 baseline here, and we can navigate up here to the nutrient breakdown. So what the nutrient breakdown tells us is, just give it 1 minute, is it will show, based on what is produced currently, what are the top food contributors towards total nutrition. And you can see it by different nutrient. So for example, here we are looking at energy. So you'll see that by food composition, as well as the amount of food produced in the system currently, rice and wheat are the top contributors towards total energy. We can view it for different nutrients too, for example, calcium. And unsurprisingly, we see that milk is the top contributor towards total calcium, followed by vegetables. Now, animal foods aren't going to be the top of everything. For example, vitamin C, your vegetables and fruit will top the list. But the key is, what I really want to drive home here is that animal foods are important contributors of some nutrients, while other nutrients like fiber, vitamin C, etc. are best sourced from plants. And this comes back to the plant-based and animal optimized argument. We saw that 85% of the food produced is plant, but animal foods are rich in many limiting nutrients and so play a really important role in a global sustainable food system. Now, the final thing I want to show you is to do with food waste. Now, we hear a lot about food waste when we consider a global sustainable food system. You've probably heard something like 30% of all food produced is currently wasted, both at a consumer level as well as a production level. So here we see, similar to the nutrient supply gaps, we see the same breakdown by nutrient and the contribution towards total waste by food group, with the same color coding as green for plant, etc. So what we see here is actually not all food is wasted equally. We're seeing a lot more green than we are seeing other colors when we look at the nutrient supply graphs. And that's because we tend to waste a lot more foods like leafy greens and vegetables. And so what that means in terms of amount of nutrients wasted is that nutrients sourced more from plant foods, such as carbohydrates and fiber, have a much higher wastage as a percent of their RDI compared to nutrients that are sourced from animal foods like calcium. So it's really important that we reduce food waste, and that does require a change in behaviours, and that's absolutely important. But when we think about that, we need to take into account that not all food is wasted equally, and understand the impact that that will have. So that sums up the live demonstration of the Delta model. So as we moved through, really the key message that we drove home is when we look at the nutrition required to feed the global population, it becomes very clear that the food system needs to be plant-based, but optimized with animal foods. So I'll now hand back to Nick for some questions.
Thanks for that. Really interesting overview. So we've got a couple of questions here. First being, if lab-grown dairy protein becomes cost competitive with traditional dairy, which dairying regions will be most affected and why?
Okay, it's an interesting question in a sense. So if in a utopian view, you'd say the least efficient, but we don't live in a utopian world. So it's because it's going to, you'd say then it should be taking out the least efficient producers of those materials. I think the challenge we've got with when we start considering lab-grown foods is the other factors around consumer choice that might choose people to select them as opposed to traditional options. So in many ways it may end up being a more Western phenomenon. So this is personal opinion, by the way, on this one. Yeah, and the sort of approach we've taken with Delta, you'd say what it should be doing is taking out the likes of inefficient production in some areas of the world.
Any other opinions from Nick or Olivia, or we shift to the next one?
Can move on that.
Another question just popped up. So what role does New Zealand take in sustainable diets? Fairly broad angle, that one.
It is a broad angle, I guess. So I'm going to answer it in a couple of ways. So one of the things is we've established the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative here as a way to start to, to help bring an evidence-based approach to a lot of those global conversations around sustainable diets. So from a technical perspective around informed discussion, we believe we can have an important role. And then when we start to look at as a production system, we are a food exporting nation. We are predominantly an exporter of animal-based products that are produced relatively efficiently through pastoral systems. And in that way, we contribute high quality animal-based nutrition to, to other countries in the world that don't have the natural advantages we do in that production.
And when it comes to tariff barriers, is there any expectation, I know this is probably more geopolitical, but in terms of where food production might occur, in a world where traditional dairy is competing with lab grown?
Well, I mean, regardless of the traditional versus lab grown, the existence of tariff barriers is a factor of the world. And it's one of those things, that's one of those complexities we haven't even dared try tackle in our modelling work around the food system, right? Because the geopolitical aspects create quite large distortions on the global food system. Now, one of the biggest, it's not just tariff barriers, it's the existence of agricultural subsidies in various Western countries that makes the whole system a lot less transparent and creates some production distortions as well globally. We know that, how that plays out, and once you get into the specifics of fermentation, that's going to depend a little bit on how it's a political question rather than a nutritional food supply technical question.
And I guess this one's probably alluding to the waste model you showed. But is there any argument around vegan sustainability? I guess probably looking to that aspect and others around how much waste is created, the micro and macronutrients.
I'll jump in on this one if I can, Andrew. Yep. So an individual vegan can absolutely have a sustainable diet. One of the points we tried to make really early on is we're talking about sustainability of the global food system. So while at an individual level, we know people choose to be vegan for many reasons outside of sustainability, that's achievable. But achieving a global food production that is oriented around vegan diets for the global population, that starts to become very challenging for sustainability, purely from a nutrition point of view, first of all, without getting into the level of food waste, the land required, that sort of thing. But from a nutritional point of view, which is the focus of the Delta model, it does not appear possible to sustainably feed a global vegan population.
Off the back of that, I think this is a very relevant question then. Would supplements fill the void with a shortage, if under the full vegan 2030 scenario?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that it does, that even under the mixed diet scenarios, we do see that there's a need for supplements to actually potentially close some nutritional gaps around the micronutrients. So within the question, we've got the question that fat's actually included there. We start to think about the macronutrients. Supplementation is not, supplementation needs to be sitting around the edges. It can't be sitting in the bulk of food. So if there's a shortage of dietary fats, that's got to come from food material somewhere. Then we've got so one of the things the model helps us do is to identify where we appear to have shortages under different scenarios and start to raise technical questions that we need to be addressed. How effective is calcium supplementation as opposed to getting calcium from a food-based source, for example? That starts to become a really important question when we have a world that appears to be short of dietary calcium, because we need to know that supplementation is effective. Otherwise, we run the risk of going down pathways relying on a support that doesn't actually play out once we actually went in reality. So that's part of the challenges there, and it's part of the role the model actually helps us to do, is understand where some of the critical food science and nutrition challenges are from a global food system perspective.
Next question relates to, I guess, our advantage on a global scale in terms of our emissions, welfare laws, labour laws, social welfare and labour laws. How can we encourage New Zealand food producers to better market value over volume?
Again, getting well into the partly this is a geopolitical question again, because it's we're constrained in the markets we can actually effectively access on a fair competitive basis. If we think about dairy, we have we can really practically access slightly over 10% of world dairy demand in a relatively low tariff environment. And the rest of it, we're playing games that we're having to try and work around rules and so forth. So that straight away constrains our ability to market aspects of our food production system over and above. So there's a challenge there, I think. We've got to have enough. We've got to have sufficient markets sufficient discerning markets we can access to be able to access a meaningful volume of consumers who are prepared to pay more. I'm not sure that we're there yet. Again, my personal opinion around this one.
And is there an angle there around the fact that New Zealand is such a large exporter that, particularly for dairy, that any value we create, if it's broad-based across dairy production, that somehow you lose the premium?
Well, so if you think about the fact that we produce something like about 2.5% of world dairy production, and we have substantially tariff-free access to slightly more than 10%, you say, it's not a broad enough base for us to be, we'd be needing to say a quarter of those consumers would need to be discerning and paying a premium for us to be getting a premium. So we need a broader base against which we can sell.
How do you think we can increase education across wider markets and communities to have a wider spread impact? I guess this is relating to the model and knowledge around that.
That's actually part of our mission in terms of creating the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, is how do we actually reach out to a wider group of people, inform them with, provide them with good evidence that they can test for themselves, so that they're speaking off the basis of knowledge, so they can then go out with their networks, and whenever the topic of food comes up, which it often does, is to be able to talk with confidence around some of these issues. So to try and create a bit of a movement around it is what we'd like to do. So we welcome people attending this session to contact us to find out more about them, more about what we're trying to do. Jump on our website, sustainablenutritioninitiative.com, and so that we can just try and build informed conversations is really the mission. It's the way we're trying to approach it, and then hopefully we can get traction that way.
Yeah, I will just add on that
Great.
in saying the Delta model doesn't give the answers. It doesn't tell you, doesn't spit out a perfect optimal food system and says this is exactly what needs to be produced. It's all about generating that insights and getting the conversation started and get people thinking the right way about what a sustainable food system is. It's not giving an answer.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for that. Just before we finish off, a reminder of what's up next. So we're on the last day of the conference today. We have, I think, 3 remaining panels and, well, all presentations actually. So we've got the Fonterra Market Outlook, which is always interesting for those who are looking for or trying to find their way, the direction of travel, the prices, etc. We've got Sea Forest, who are talking seaweed supplements and what that will mean for methane production, and BlackRock on the commodity super cycle. So thank you all for joining us, and again, a special thanks to Andrew, Olivia, and Nick. Really appreciate you giving your time to share your insights. And we'll see you on the next one.